Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulence and change, it's hard to keep track. A big one started back in February 2022. It actually started almost a decade earlier when Vladimir Putin started to make moves into Ukraine, but it was late February when a full scale invasion of that peaceful country next door um, disrupted terrorized and destroyed huge parts of life in that country and a huge generation of Russian soldiers still unfolding. We have climate change and pandemic reverberations and the misinformation. But today we're going to focus on a very interesting story, a potent and powerful film that's premiering next week, June 6th, at the Tribeca Film Festival here down in New York City, where I used to hang out. And it is directed by and co-written by and produced by Josh Zeman, who I've gotten to know over a long period of time through his previous films, one in particular. And I'm constrained from posting a full review until the day of the premiere, but I will tell you it is an extraordinary portrait of humanity and inhumanity, centered around the plight of humans and other animals at this wildlife park that happened to be situated right on the front lines in part of Ukraine when there was a Russian foray again in late February. And the film has death, life, wrenching loss, heroism, boundless love, trans species love, and love between people. Unbelievable moments and transformation, which is a big part of any film, any documentary. For example, there's a young veterinarian who is one of the volunteers who rushes to help rescue these animals, who's now serving in the military. He's a medic. He will move from being a veterinarian to being focusing on human animals. So, Josh, just first of all, congratulations on an incredible project, and good luck with it as it rolls forward. I do want to kind of quickly touch back on how we first met, which was it 2004 when I wrote that article about the missing whale? There was this
That's right.
lonely whale in the Pacific, and some old military Navy sonograms were picking up the sound, and it wasn't a blue whale and it wasn't a fin whale. And I did two little stories, and this is pre-social media. I think they would have been viral. It would have been a viral thing if there had
Oh,
been
absolutely.
something. And but then that sort of festered and simmered for a long time. And this filmmaker who has done Cropsey and films about other tough topics, Son of Sam, he something there was a thread there that you pulled and couldn't stop pulling. And now here we are. The war unfolds, which I've written many aspects of, but I have not gone to Ukraine, even though my grandfather is from there. And it's transformed everything. Here was a piece I did on food insecurity in Ukraine. This literally one of the bread baskets of the world was turned into an inferno. And then here's this film and this story. This started. Can you tell us how you first became aware that there was something here that needed telling?
Yeah, it's so funny, Andy, only because your article in the New York Times sparked me to do The Loneliest Whale. And it was a second article in the New York Times about a chimp named Chi-Chi who was temporarily staying in a zoo in the middle of Kharkiv, which is, again, only 25 miles from the Russian border. It was being bombed every day. And there was a chimp that had escaped from its temporary place in the Kharkiv Zoo, and it was wandering through what's known as Freedom Square in the middle of the war. And it was just that juxtaposition, of animals kind of shocking people out of this war mentality and suddenly saying, oh my God, there's a monkey walking around in the middle of Freedom Square. Who's going to go get the monkey? And
Right.
it's a chimp. And one of the zookeepers walked over. It was slightly raining. She held out a yellow raincoat, and Chi-Chi loves raincoats. And Chi-Chi came over. She put on the raincoat. Another zookeeper brought out a bicycle. and they biked Chi-Chi back to her temporary shelter in the Kharkiv Zoo. She had actually been in Eco Park Feldman. And it was just, again, that juxtaposition of freedom, animals looking for freedom, wanting to escape, and inside, this Kharkiv, this city that's under siege. And I started to look at all these stories about zoos in the middle of war, the Berlin Zoo, the London Zoo. There's a long and interesting history of zoos being this Garden of Eden, almost in the middle of a city, European city that's kind of under siege from an invading army. And that really just led me to make this story. I called up and said, hey, I had heard that Chi-Chi came from another zoo that had been bombed out, and that was eventually Eco Park Feldman. And I called up Eco Park Feldman, and I just wanted to hear more about the story.
It's amazing. Had they already been sharing their videos and stuff at that time? I want to show. I'm not going to show anything clips from the film because it's embargoed until the premiere. But there's a key moment when this sort of became a phenomenon on social media. And here's this is from their Facebook page.
Сьогодні місяць початку війни, і ми продовжуємо евакуацію тварин.
Just surreal. Again, surreal. And the fact that there was kind of a record being made, when you started to think about this as a film, I assume, especially because it's in a war zone, made it more possible to sort of think about how to pursue it.
Yeah, it was just this, I had heard about the story, and then I spoke to the head of the social media department. He's like, yes, we have an unbelievable amount of videos. And it was very interesting when these so that young man is Timothy, and he is a veterinarian, and he heard about what was happening at Eco Park Feldman, the fact that there were these animals kind of trapped between the Russian and the Ukrainian army without food and water. And he volunteered and brought his friends, basically. He has a crew of 4 kids, who are his friends that he's known since high school. And they're like, we're going to start taking these animals out. And they started to document on their cell phones everything that they were doing. It was just so funny, who drives around in a converted ambulance with, wallabies and kangaroos, taking them to safety. And he started documenting it, and then they started to put that information out, and it really did become viral. I think, war is so tragic, and I think people were looking also just for bright spots in what was going on, and what's brighter than saving animals.
Yeah, bright spots, but with this simultaneous, sense of deep tragedy, and not only that, but a perpetual possibility of even worse, which we still, Ukraine still faces. These are some images that were sent in the sort of the pitch deck last year, and I think this captures. This is the guy who founded this amazing place, Alexander Feldman. He had gone back at one point, and you see this. So tell me about. Well, again, get into the production a little bit. How did you then start to work with what was there through the social media? But then you also, there are these sit-down interviews and everything. They're just beautiful. So how did this unfold from that point forward?
So I contacted the guys at Feldman Eco Park, and they started to send me clips that they had been posting. They had a lot of clips, and it started to dawn on me that, yes, you can tell this story through all the clips that the kids had shot. I then got a little bit of seed money, and I went to Kharkiv about 6 months into the war. And it was still a hot zone. Like, we had to go fly into Warsaw, drive across the border. We took a cinematographer with us, a guy named Oliver Sarbil, who had also shot Restrepo about the Afghanistan.
Oh, wow.
So he's a war photographer, and I had no idea about, being in a war zone. And we went in, we had flak jackets, the whole 9 yards, and we interviewed these individuals while the bombs were falling. and heard their story. We then went and edited for a couple months and then went back again 6 months later. What's so interesting is when we went back 6 months later, everybody was very happy. Kharkiv was out of danger. This had the counterinsurgency, if you will, the counterattack had pushed the Russians away. Now, I spoke to a lot of the folks literally 2 days ago, and Kharkiv is once again embattled.
Absolutely. It's very much in the headlines right now.
Yeah. Glide bombs are falling all over them. The park again is once again under attack. Thankfully, there's less animals there than there were before. There's still, water buffalo and things like that in there. But the horror has returned for these people, and it's unfortunately a very desperate situation. When it seemed like when they were first starting, there was a lot of patriotism, a lot of fervor for fighting the war, and now 3 years in, that's a little less. That's they're war weary, if you will.
That's for sure. And as I mentioned, Timothy has gone from being a veterinarian pursuing a PhD to being a medic in the Army. So
it's beautiful. Some people just have that innate quality of trying to heal and save, and this kid holds that. He holds that space, and very happy-go-lucky. We noted in the film he's always smiling, and I think that's something that veterinarians and medics need, right? They need us. They need to keep everybody happy as much as they can, and animals feel it and people feel it.
Yeah. You mentioned his character. He effuses that sense of optimism and let's do this. And that posse he has, makes it into kind of a one of those buddy films in a way against this tough backdrop. He reminds me of in the great series 14 Up, 28 Up. The cab driver. I don't know if you must have seen those films, the documentaries.
Yeah.
There are certain people who are born with that kind of, or born and or nurtured to have that sort of spirit.
Well, as you see in the film, Timothy and his brother is actually there. His brother, if you're looking at that picture, his brother is in the red right there. He comes from a farm north of Kharkiv with 15 children. His parents said he has 15 brothers and sisters.
Kind of mind-blowing. So, was it a tough sell to go around saying we need to make a film about a zoo in a war? I have my own feelings looking at it now, understanding completely, but how did those, and how do you, before someone sees it, how do you explain why that's a good lens on this thing called war and peace?
Well, it's just, there's many stories about the war going on in Kharkiv, in Ukraine, but there's just not many about the perspective from animals. And it's just a different lens with which to look at what's going on. But, and Andrew, you know this, when we talk about animals, it affects us differently. It changes the way in which we look at our own human experience and what we do as a species. And that is the power of a human and the interconnected species talking about animals. It just provides an unbelievable palate cleanser. And so it doesn't just become about, bombs and evacuations and things like that. It just takes on a whole new perspective. And so, strangely enough, that part wasn't so difficult. It wasn't difficult to convince people that this is an important lens with which to look through war, and not just the Ukraine war, but all war. And furthermore, and I think that this is really one of the more interesting things that came out of this, what do we do about animals in conflict zones? What do we do about animals in climate change conflict zones, in in times of disasters and things like that. And this is something that we need to start thinking about as we lean into more turbulent times.
Yeah, for sure. And the Timothy, again, the young veterinarian, makes a point even about animals in captivity generally toward the end, which is really interesting because I was talking about this with my wife, and she hasn't seen it yet. But you know, having that wildlife park, zoos are great, as my wife was saying too. Zoos are great; they're great educational environments we've all benefited from. But this also illustrates, if anything, that they are also a sort of a microcosm, and if it gets disrupted, it's kind of a problematic. That point is made late in the film too.
Yeah, it's something that I think a lot of people didn't quite realize, is that there needs to be protocols in place.
Yeah.
If there is a disaster, there needs to be protocols, euthanasia protocols in place, evacuation protocols in place. And again, there were so many zoos that were suddenly found themselves inundated. Yes, they put small measures in place, but Putin's invasion was so surprising to them that I think they were caught off guard. They had stockpiled food. So, a lot of it suddenly became, okay, what do we do in the next conflict? And there's a number of different other documentaries out there that kind of deal a little bit with like people and evacuations. One of the most interesting things to me, if you watch all the footage about 6 million people who evacuated basically from one side of the country and even out of the country, they're all carrying their dogs, they're all carrying their cats, they're all carrying their pets. And so we make accounts of evacuating people, but not animals. And this came up, of course, in Katrina. One of the women who was with us, a photographer, a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer named Carol Guzzi. Carol Guzzi won a Pulitzer for her work in talking about the animals during Katrina. All these people were being evacuated to the Superdome. I think it was the Superdome, right? And they did not want to leave their homes if they couldn't bring their animals. Their animals were their children. And so that opened up a lot of people's eyes. People literally refused to go and probably died because they didn't want to leave their animals alone.
Yeah. So here again from social media, I'm going to show a clip of Alexander Feldman, for whom this place is named, and who was a wealthy businessman whose business was destroyed in Kharkiv. And here he was.
Сегодня мы закладываем первый камень, открываем хоспис, самый большой, самый лучший,
sort of a fundraiser.
Самый профессиональный, самый современный в Украине для домашних и диких животных. Огромное количество животных пострадало, как и домашних, так и диких, которые, попадая к нам, будет проходить полная.
So tell me about some of the characters who became central to this.
Feldman is a really interesting character. When you see him, your mind kind of jumps to the Russian oligarch type of character. He's rich and he made all his money opening up one of the largest markets in Ukraine and in Europe, actually. And he just he grew up under Russian occupation and loved animals and built this zoo. Of course, here's where we get into the issue of what is a zoo, right? Is it for education or is it for entertainment? And they were very much centered in education. Yet at the same time, he's a very colorful character. And whenever you talk about the animals, he cries at the drop of a hat. And he started this zoo. It was very popular because it was so close to Russia. You had many Russian people coming, you had many Ukrainian people coming, and suddenly it was destroyed. And Feldman, he was a millionaire, and he has been consistently selling everything that he has. He had one of the largest wine collections in Europe. He had art. He had everything. He has everything that a almost billionaire would have. But slowly but surely, he's been selling everything. And that was just fascinating. A little bit of almost like a Schindler's List type of character. A rich guy who spends all his life building these worldly possessions, you know, and then has to sell them to keep the animals alive, for food, for medicine, to keep the people. And so that was really interesting. I kept like, what's it like, spending your life building one of the largest wine collections in Ukraine and then turning around and selling it for nothing,
Yeah. I hope people who are watching can share this, of course, either now or later with folks, and they can ask questions if they want to. I'm just going to post a little note about that. Where you said there was active military. There were military activities while you were there. The 2 times you went over, and you were learning on the run from the Restrepo cameraman.
Yes, that's correct.
Sebastian Younger, at the times people, they go to like a boot camp, literally to do basic training before they go into harm's way. What was that like? Or were there any particular moments that you were wondering whether you made a bad decision?
It's always, I had to do training, medical training, combat medical training before going over. I was not prepared. It's just many of us in the United States and even journalists, we just don't have that experience. And so going over there, it was crazy. It was crazy having to fly into Warsaw and then having to have a woman, in fact, pick us up because men can't leave the country, and then just going in to see this country that was under siege. But the thing I think that I was most interested in, or I found most interesting, was just the willpower of the Ukrainians to fight back against Russia. Like, you saw it everywhere, and they were so willing to die for Ukraine. And it was interesting. I asked many people who I was sitting down with, Kharkiv is 30 miles from Russia. It was under Russian occupation for an unbelievable, decades. And so a lot of their families are still just over the border in Russia. They speak Russian. And I asked them, I said, why are you guys so willing to die for this cause? Why don't you just say, okay, and let Russia take you over? Is there, it's just an occupation. Is it worth your life? And they said, no way. We've had this taste of freedom and we're willing to die for it. And that was a really striking moment for me. It was so important to them to have their own agency, and have their own freedom, and live the life that they wanted, that they were willing to die for that freedom. And, we talk about freedom and patriotism and jingoism here in the United States, but here's a country that's truly being tested for what that means and putting themselves on the line for it.
Yeah, and this gets to the whole issue of American funding and the lack of it, and what is this war about? How it is relevant for us, whether we want to think that or not. What Putin has been doing these last years.
It really is just unbelievable. Kharkiv was it's the second largest city in Ukraine. It had a tech hub. It had 3 colleges. It was very beautiful, in a lot of ways, and very future forward. It was like going to be the gates of technology for that part of the world. And suddenly they wake up one day and hundreds of tanks are just coming across the border, and they're being bombed. And to see it, it didn't make sense to them. And they were like, I can't believe that I'm in a almost World War II situation here in 2022. And they're like, it's like we're in medieval times or something with this war. They just couldn't fathom it. They couldn't believe that Putin would be so crazy as to do such a thing.
Yeah. This is another social media clip that, again, I'm not, I wouldn't want to show anything from the film. You can't show it again before the premiere, but here's from social media, which is integrated into the film. Again, this was, there was a drone overhead, and
и там еще парочкой. Над нами дрон. Это плохо. Так, эвакуация волка. Одного забираем сейчас, и там еще... И там еще парочкой. Над нами дрон. Это плохо. Так, эвакуация.
And they were
Одного
there was
забираем сейчас, и там
and
еще...
bombardment not long after that. I think he's an interesting character too. This guy, if he's the one I think of, he had a tough upbringing or tough life, and sort of the zoo. There are these again extraordinary scenes in this film of the humanity part of humans, taking care of these animals, and the animals taking care of the people. What do you think about it? Is he the one I'm thinking of?
Yeah, he's a former addict, living on the streets, eating out of garbage cans, tried to kill himself many times, and basically through a program that Feldman had started, he was living on the grounds and started working with the animals, and the animals saved his life. And he's such an amazing character. It's one of his connection with animals is one of really affects me. He says, when I look into the eyes of an animal, I see true love. And to me, that was just amazing. It's funny. You talk to everybody about the war and everybody hates the war, but he's like, actually, I like the war because before the war, I wasn't working with animals, and the war basically gave him purpose. It connected him with the animals. Before the war, he had just been in the the drug rehabilitation program. It was during the war that they asked him to help with the evacuation, and that's where he really developed this connection with these animals. When I first met this guy, I was like, oh, he's the head zookeeper, because he's like, hugging animals, and his nonverbal language with animals was just so incredible. I was like, oh, this must be the head zookeeper. And like, no, that's the guy who's been with us, the shortest amount of time. And I was just,
wow,
so
that's really interesting to hear, because again, in the film, you have this sense of him being kind of a pillar of the operation. And again, I don't think it's spoiler alert stuff, but there are some devastating things that happen to people as this is unfolding. This is not just some touchy-feely story about people rescuing animals. There's human death, young and older, and it's again gets at this. There's a moment in the film when an animal does great violence to a keeper because it was starving, and I think it was Timothy, one of the characters says, it wasn't the lion's fault. It wasn't the man's fault. It was the war's fault. And taking it out to that outer dimension, I think, which is really, really invaluable too. So what's your hope for the film? Obviously, Tribeca is a great achievement getting it shown there. Would this be a release in theaters or stay tuned?
Stay tuned. I mean, I hope more people get it. I hope, I love stories about animals, but unique stories about animals, whether it's the loneliest whale and, ocean sound and military, sonographs and things like that. And I think this is just a really interesting film, not necessarily about the Ukraine war, but just about animals in war, just this perspective of war that we don't quite think about.
Yeah.
But that has a very unique history and again, allows us to reframe what's going on outside of the politics, outside of the polarization, but just, people and animals, and fleshing out the inhumanity we do to ourselves, do to others, through the eyes of these animals. There's the whole point. Andre, the guy we just saw, makes that point. Like, some humans are animals, and some animals are more human. And so when we say you're an animal or like a beast, like, really, in the grand scheme of things, where do we fit on that paradigm? Because, considering what's going on, I would say that we are the lower species, or we are the more brutal, Yeah,
that comes through. Again, I can't recommend it highly enough, and I hope you have a great response at Tribeca, and going forward, maybe we can dive in again on some component of this after the flurry around the release.
Yeah. I think I learned quite a bit about animal welfare in Eastern Europe, about definitely animal welfare in relation to disasters, climate change, especially. I think there are many, many lessons that the U.S. is going to face that could be taken from what happened in Ukraine as we get into more flooding, as we get into tornadoes, as we get into all the effects of climate change.
Yeah. And again, to me, one of the high level, I don't like the word messages, themes in the film is the animal vantage point on war. In other words, it's sort of animals looking at us going, WTF.
Totally, right? Like, how could you do this? Or just, what does freedom truly mean? How can we not understand, the context? And then there's one more point, which I think is, we love animals, but do we really respect animals? Do we truly respect their agency? And how do we reconcile the need for zoos from an educational standpoint with putting an animal in a cage? Who has that right? And that's something I struggle with all the time. And so I think, it's a great way to kind of bring that story to a head, especially when people are fighting for their freedom. So again, these are all big points that come out in the film, and hopefully people will think about.
Just a concluding thought from me is I had a conversation recently with Carl Safina, and a bird collision expert, after Flacco the owl had its demise in New York City after having been in the zoo for a year. And for years, many zoos, and it was free for a year and became this freedom icon for New Yorkers, and then it perished. And there's so many questions to address here. So thanks again, Josh Zeman. Checkpoint Zoo, make sure you check it out. If you're in New York City, I imagine it's impossible to get Tribeca tickets at this point, but try to find this film, make noise about it, and good luck with it. And keep me apprised of what you're up to next.
I will. And you're always a wonderful inspiration for so many stories. And so I thank you for that. If it wasn't for your initial article about the loneliest whale, I might not even be here. So thank you.
Well, onward we go in our journeys, sometimes entwined.
Yes.
Thank you. And everybody, as soon as we're done right here, you can share the link you've been watching on. I'll be posting this on my Substack thingy, revkin.substack.com. Get in touch with me through that scrolling, distracting little bar at the bottom. And I'm doing another show later today, at 1 p.m. today, on the Ocean Agency, which is essentially a photo agency for the world's ocean and how to conserve it. So it's also about imagery and impact. Thanks again, Josh.
Thanks, Andy. Take care.
And hold on just